Are you trying to decide how to set up all your gear to catch more fish? If so, this video is for you. Welcome back to another episode of 5 Minute Fish Talk, a show where I've got 5 minutes to discuss all things fishing. Now, this show actually appears every single Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern Time Zone. Stay tuned. Click subscribe. Do it, do it, do it. Thank you so much to Disconnected Off-Road for this week's suggestion. I thought this was such an interesting question that I just had to make a video. Let's get started. Love it, love it, love it. Guys, there's 5 minutes on my timer here. You know what that means, right? I know what it means. Boop. It's time to get real. And here's the thing. This is such a cool subject. You know, I've had a little bit of trouble thinking about how I want to craft this message, but this is such an important subject, and here's why. I think there's so many people out there that really, they'll ask, like, what kind of rod and line and this and that and other thing do I need for a spinnerbait? What do I need for a jerkbait? What do I need? And they think about it and they ask, like, what do they need for a certain lure? But they don't necessarily think about the why behind the answers they're getting. So if somebody says, what do I need for a jig? And someone says a 7.2 medium heavy fast action rod, they're like, okay, I'm gonna go buy that. But why is that gonna be a good rod for you? Well, that's the question we're all asking today. So what makes this subject so important? Why is this subject so vitally important to understand? You know? I know. Here's why it's so important, because I hate losing fish. Do you like losing fish? You don't like losing fish, do you? No. This is important. If you want to keep fish penned and bring them all the way up to the boat or up to the bank or whatever, you need to make sure that your gear is properly set up so that way you can hook and land more fish. So let's get into it a little bit here, guys. Let's get into an example. What is going to be the number one factor that you need to think about?
I don't know.
Well, the number one factor you need to think about is your hook size, your hook specs as a whole. So let's look at a jig versus a crankbait as an example. Now, this is a very dramatic example. It's very obvious what the differences are, right? The first one that all of you are thinking in your head right now is, well, this one has treble hooks and this one has a single hook. That is very true. This has 6 points on it and this one has 1.
Well, duh.
Now, with that, there's other things to think about as well. With these treble hooks, what is the difference? Well, they have a much shorter shank. So there's only a little bit of hook space for once a fish gets hooked to stay on. That's why a lot of times people actually lose a lot of fish on crankbaits. It's also a much thinner wire, thinner gauge hook. And they're obviously just a much smaller hook as well. So then you look at a jig and it's a heavier gauge. It's a much longer shank, so that way there's more room on it. So once a fish gets hooked, there's all sorts of space these fish can go. And so that's one key difference here. So let's think about that a little bit, right? Let's think about, you know, you have these lighter wire hooks and then you have this heavy gauge hook. What would that mean from a rod perspective? How do you think that you should make a different change on a rod? Do you think that this and this should be fished on the same rod? If you can help it, I would say absolutely not. But if you can't afford multiple rods, you can get one that is kind of one size fits all. But if you can't afford multiple rods, I would say that a crankbait should generally be fished on a much softer balance rod, something that has a lot more give. Why is that? Because these hooks are so much smaller and they're so much lighter. So it's not going to take as much power to drive the hook. But then at the same time, you want that rod to be soft to where these fish can pull and these fish can get a little bit of that bounce to them and not just rip the hooks right out. If you were to fish this same crankbait on a broomstick, on something that's really heavy and you know, just has a lot of backbone, you set the hook on it, you drive the hooks, but what happens is you drive the hooks all the way through and it literally will rip right out of the fish's mouth because these hooks are too small and the rod was too heavy for these hooks. So then let's take that on the contrary here, we talk about a jig. If you're fishing with that broomstick and you have this single heavy gauge hook, that might be what it takes to actually get the hook to all the way penetrate through the fish's mouth. If you're doing a soft rod, this hook won't go far enough and then all of a sudden after like 3 or 4 winds, he'll be gone because it never actually got hooked properly. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, drop a comment below and I can elaborate a little bit further. But by and large, that's what you need to think about. So let's talk about it a little bit. I've got 3 rods here. We've got a spinning rod and it's a little ultralight, right? So what kind of rod or what kind of hook am I generally throwing on this? I'm using a very small hook. I'm using something on 4-pound test and I'm using something that has a lot of bend. Because I'm using these small hooks, I want something that's going to make sure it has enough give to it that I'm not absolutely just ripping the hook right out of the fish's mouth. Now with that, I still want to set my drag a little bit looser, and my rod still needs to have some bend because it is so small, but on top of that it is a single hook as well. So you have to have some backbone to drive it in the first place. Does that all make sense? I know it's more of a physics thing than it is even fishing at this point. And then on the other hand, we've got this big stout rod with braid on it. What kind of hooks will I be using on this? Stuff like frogs, stuff like jigs, anything that's got a big heavy gauge hook that I can drive home and it'll stay pinned. I would never throw a crankbait on this, and I would never wow! Wow! Ah. Guys, that's 5 minutes. Let's talk about my last rod. This is a crankbait rod. The major difference here is it's got a ton of flex to it, and the reason being is that way I can keep those fish pinned and they're not going to just rip the hooks right out of the fish's mouth. If none of this doesn't make sense, if it's not adding up, like I said, you can drop a comment below. Heck, you can DM me on Instagram and I can help you as much as I possibly can. I love helping on this kind of stuff. I'm not an expert by any means, but I think I have a general idea of, this type of subject because I was always pretty good at science and math in school, and that's why it kind of clicks in my head. Nerd! Maybe I'm not a very good teacher. Hopefully you got a little bit out of this video. Regardless, thank you so much for watching. If you have a suggestion like Disconnected Off-Road did, make sure to drop it below, and if I choose it, I'll give you a shout out. And then, guys, last but not least, have yourself a fantastic weekend, and we'll catch you next time.